Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're cracking open excerpts from a book that takes a really unique angle on something pretty fundamental.
And maybe a little unsettling.
Yeah, exactly. Why societies sometimes, well, lose their footing and slide into crisis, into political disintegration.
The source material for this is Peter Turchin's book, End Times, Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration.
And our mission today is to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, maybe some uncomfortable truths from this. We want to give you a different lens, really, to view history and, even current events.
Moving beyond the simple day-to-day headlines.
Right. We're digging into a more complex, data-informed view.
That's right. And the source material, it really pushes us right from the start to shift our focus.
How so?
Yeah. It argues we need to look past the actions of individuals, however corrupt or even malicious they might seem on the surface. The book says the real insights often come from big data, long-term trends in things like wages, taxes, GDP, large-scale surveys, that kind of thing.
So you're saying the numbers, these huge statistical patterns, are actually more telling than, say, analyzing a specific president's decisions or a king's personality.
Exactly. It's not that individual actions don't matter at all. Of course they do. But they're often symptoms, maybe triggers, acting within these much larger structural patterns.
And understanding those patterns isn't straightforward.
No, not at all. The source really emphasizes that you need tools from complexity science to even begin to make sense of all the interconnected dynamics in a society.
Okay, complexity science looking at big data. So when it does that, what does it identify as a sort of core problem driving this instability?
The central model presented predicts that major problems really start brewing when extra wealth flows disproportionately to the very top.
Not just the 1% we always hear about.
Often much narrower, the top 0.1%, even the 0.01% sometimes.
Ah, right. You mentioned this wealth pump idea before.
Precisely that. And this massive concentration of wealth, it fundamentally reshapes the whole social pyramid.
How does that work?
You end up with a society that's very top-heavy, meaning you just have far too many people competing, scrambling for a limited number of positions of power, status, influence.
Whether that's in government or business or media.
Exactly. Academia, too. And the source has a specific term for this condition. Elite overproduction.
Elite overproduction. Okay, so too many chefs in the kitchen, basically. Too many people fighting for the top spots.
In a nutshell, yes. And the source argues this usually happens alongside something else, something impacting the broader population.
Which is?
Popular immiseration. This is basically the declining well-being, whether it's relative or absolute, of the common people.
Okay, so things getting worse for the average person.
Right. And the source argues that these two forces, elite overproduction at the top, popular immiseration at the bottom, combined with the inevitable intra-like conflicts.
Because they're all fighting each other for those limited spots.
Exactly. That whole combination gradually eats away at what the book calls civic cohesiveness. Trust in institutions collapses, social norms start to fray, and the whole system begins to unravel from the inside.
Okay, let's dive deeper into that elite overproduction idea. Because the source uses this really vivid analogy. It's like a game of musical chairs, right?
Yeah, it's a great way to picture it.
Imagine you have a set number of chairs. Those are the high-status positions. But you keep adding more and more people who desperately want a seat.
Right.
If you double or triple the competitors for the same number of chairs, the number of people left standing, the frustrated ones, it doesn't just double. The source says it can balloon like tenfold or 20-fold.
It's that nonlinear effect, you see. The competition just becomes exponentially more intense, cutthroat even.
And in the real world, this kind of desperate competition, it incentivizes people to bend the rules or just break them entirely.
Absolutely. To get ahead, people start ignoring the established norms, the way things are supposed to be done.
And the source gives a name to someone willing to basically toss the rule book out to win that game. They're called a counter-elite.
Exactly. They operate outside or sometimes directly against the established norms of the existing power structure.
Okay.
And as more and more of these aspirants are produced by the system and the rules get bent and broken more often, the source describes it vividly. It devolves into a free-for-all fistfight.
That's quite the image.
It's not just metaphorical language, though. It's presented as a kind of model for understanding the escalating, often ugly, consequences of severe elite overproduction in a real society.
And the book gives some fascinating and very different examples of people who rose right to the top during these ages of discord when these pressures were incredibly high.
Yeah, think Abraham Lincoln right before the U.S. Civil War.
Okay.
Or Hong Xiuquan, who led the massive Taiping Rebellion in 19th century China. A huge, devastating conflict.
And Donald Trump in our own time.
Yes. Now, obviously, these are vastly different figures, different contexts, different outcomes. Lincoln sought to preserve the Union. Hong sought to overthrow an empire. Trump's impact is still unfolding.
But the common thread?
The source points to them as examples of elite aspirants, though maybe aspirant doesn't quite capture the scale, who reach the absolute pinnacle of power precisely when their societies were buckling under these structural stresses.
Yeah.
Immiseration, elite overproduction, intense factionalism.
So Trump's presidency, while thankfully not leading to a full-blown civil war like the 1860s or the Taiping Rebellion.
It certainly coincided with significant social unrest, deep political polarization, challenges to norms, things that fit the pattern the model describes for an age of discord.
Okay, so that's the pressure cooker at the top. Too many elites, not enough chairs. But you mentioned popular immiseration as the other key ingredient. What does that look like from the ground, according to the source?
Well, the book uses a kind of persona, a guy named Steve, to make this really relatable.
Okay, tell me about Steve.
Steve's part of what Guy Standing called the precariat, people in precarious work. He's skilled, right?
Yeah.
Good mechanic, wants steady work, but he's stuck bouncing between low-paying, temporary gigs.
And he feels resentful.
Yeah, he resents being called lazy, feels things should be like they were for his parents or grandparents. And the source directly links this feeling to slogans like, "Make America Great Again," that desire for a perceived better past.
And his media habits are part of this picture, too. He distrusts the mainstream.
Completely. Views outlets like CNN as fake news, even on basic factual stuff, and instead relies on alternative sources, bloggers, YouTubers.
And the source contrasts Steve's view with, say, a Catherine figure.
Right, someone who might look at Steve and think, well, it's his own fault. Didn't get a college degree, maybe doesn't manage money well, buys guns instead of saving for retirement. That kind of individual explanation.
That definitely paints a picture of the cultural divide. But you said we need data. Does the source's data actually back up Steve's experience? Is the average worker's well-being declining?
The data cited in the book is pretty clear, yeah. Worker wages have been under significant pressure for decades now.
From the usual suspects.
Well, the source mentions them. The big baby boomer generation hitting the workforce, more women participating, immigration, globalization shifting jobs overseas, automation. All the standard explanations are there.
Okay, but what's interesting, you said, is the source points to something else as maybe more important.
Exactly. It highlights recent economic research, people like Stansbury and Summers, Michel and Bivens, suggesting that declining worker power is actually a more significant factor in wage suppression, specifically from the late 70s to the late 2010s, than just technology or companies getting bigger.
More important than robots taking jobs or monopolies.
According to this research, yes.
Yeah.
The book points out that this shift in the balance of power between labor and capital accounted for something like 3/4 of the gap that opened up between productivity growth, how much stuff we're making per hour, and median hourly pay during that period, 1979 to 2017.
Wow, 3/4. That's huge.
It really is.
Yeah.
It suggests it's not just about efficiency gains not being shared, it's about the fundamental power dynamic shifting.
So there's a growing consensus, at least among some economists cited in the source, that unequal power played a much bigger role than we usually assume in holding down non-elite pay since the 70s. That really challenges the standard story.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about money either. The source links these worsening economic conditions for the less educated directly to a decline in, well, community, traditional social institutions.
Like what?
Things like stable families, church involvement, strong unions, good local schools, neighborhood groups, all these things that historically provided connection and support seem to be weakening. There's this overall decline in what sociologists call social connectedness.
And this ties into that really sobering research on deaths of despair, right, by Case and Deaton.
Exactly. The source notes that while economic hardship is definitely part of that tragic story, rising suicide rates, drug overdoses, alcohol-related liver disease, especially among less educated, middle-aged white Americans, the breakdown of social connection, of community, is also vitally important to understanding it. It's not just economics.
Okay, so let's look at the wage data again. The source uses relative wages. What does that show?
Right. Wages divided by GDP per capita. The argument is this gives a better long-term picture of how common people are doing relative to the overall economy's size. And the U.S. pattern is remarkable.
How so?
Relative wages nearly doubled between 1780 and 1830, a period of rising fortunes for ordinary Americans. Then they fell sharply by 1860, leading into the Civil War.
Okay.
They stayed low for about 50 years, until around 1910. Then, during the Great Compression era, they nearly doubled again by 1960.
So another period of rising equality.
Yes, but since about 1970, they've steadily declined. The source states they lost almost 30% between 1976 and 2016 alone.
30% in 40 years. That's a massive reversal.
It really illustrates that wealth pump mechanism the theory talks about, operating over these long historical cycles, mechanisms that seem to systematically enrich the top tier at the expense of the broad base of labor over time.
Okay, so we have popular immiseration driven a lot by declining worker power, leading to social disconnection. But going back to elite overproduction, the source is clear. It's not just about billionaires, right? It hits the educated class, too.
Exactly. While, on average, people with degrees have done better economically, the source stresses that the educated class today isn't the kind of stable, monolithic group it might have seemed back in, say, the 1950s or 60s.
So playing that aspirant game again, the musical chairs, what matters is the balance, supply and demand for graduates.
Precisely. The balance between the supply of young people getting advanced degrees and the actual demand for jobs that require those specific skills.
And the finding is?
By the 2000s, the number of graduates vastly outstripped the number of available positions needing those degrees. The imbalance is huge in areas like social sciences and humanities, but the source points out it even exists in many STEM fields now.
It mentions an overproduction of PhDs.
Yes, and quotes the economist Noah Smith, who described how traditional academic jobs just dried up, condemning many PhDs to a, quote, bleak existence of low-wage contingent work.
Like adjunct teaching, precarious postdocs.
Right. Smith uses this striking analogy. They're like waiters hanging around Hollywood hoping for their big break. And yet, the universities keep churning out more PhDs.
So even within the supposedly well-off, educated part of society, you have this significant and growing group facing precarity.
Absolutely. Guy Standing, who popularized that term precariat, explicitly includes these degree holders as a key faction within that class. They have the credentials, but not the security or status they expected.
Now, here's where the source makes a really provocative, maybe uncomfortable claim based on historical data. It argues that this group, the credentialed precariat, the frustrated elite aspirants, they're historically the most dangerous class for societal stability.
Yes. It sounds counterintuitive, maybe, but the analysis of historical databases presented in the source suggests their overproduction has been a major factor driving social upheavals throughout history.
Like the revolutions of 1848 in Europe.
That's a key example. And more recently, the Arab Spring in 2011, where high youth unemployment among educated populations was a major contributing factor.
And revolutionary leaders often come from this group.
Very often. Hong Juquan, the Taiping leader we mentioned, failed the civil service exam multiple times, became a village teacher. Mao Zedong was also a teacher and librarian assistant early on.
So the source directly challenges Marx on this.
Explicitly. It argues Marx was wrong. It's generally not the most downtrodden, immiserated workers who successfully lead revolutions. According to this data-driven perspective, the truly dangerous revolutionaries tend to be these frustrated elite aspirants.
Why them?
Because they often possess the education, the rhetorical skills, the organizational abilities, sometimes the privilege and connections to actually mobilize people and wield influence on a larger scale.
They have the tools to challenge the system.
Right. Even educated young people who do land elite jobs might feel insecure in today's climate. But the source argues that the growing group doomed to the educated precariat. They feel they have nothing to lose but their precarity.
That's a powerful inversion of Marx. Okay, shifting gears slightly, how does the source actually describe the power structure in the U.S. today? It uses the term plutocracy.
Yes, but it emphasizes using it in a neutral descriptive sense, meaning rule by wealth, rule by the wealthy.
So, dominated by economic elites.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The owners and top managers of major assets, big corporations, banks, powerful law firms, media conglomerates.
And it lists specific influential sectors.
Yeah, the usual suspects, plus maybe some less obvious ones. The military-industrial complex, FIRE, that's finance, insurance, real estate, energy, Silicon Valley, big pharma, big food, the medical industrial complex, and even the education industrial complex.
And lobbying is obviously a huge part of this. The numbers are staggering.
12,000 lobbyists spending nearly $4 billion federally in just 1 year, 2021. Pharma, electronics, insurance often top the list.
But unlike a military command, these elites don't have a single leader.
No, the source stresses there's no center, no one person calling all the shots. It's more of a network. Their collective action happens through shared social spaces, elite schools, private clubs, overlapping corporate boards, professional groups like the Chamber of Commerce, and these policy planning networks, think tanks, foundations.
So power is distributed and networked, and they don't always agree.
Definitely not. The source notes there are often significant internal disagreements and factions within the elite group.
And this picture contrasts sharply with the textbook view of American democracy, right? The majoritarian electoral democracy idea.
Right. The idea that government is of the people, by the people, for the people, with policy shaped mainly by what voters want via elections.
The source argues that's often not how it works in practice.
It argues that frequently policy outcomes align more closely with the preferences of economic elites and their organized interest groups than with the preferences of the average citizen. Elections matter, but they don't always translate directly into policy reflecting broad public will.
And globalization itself is framed as part of this, another aspect of the wealth pump.
Yes, the source argues it's been a tool used by governing elites to increase their own wealth and power, partly by accessing cheaper labor overseas, which benefits capital, but also by potentially weakening worker organization at home.
How does it do that?
By creating competition, sometimes antagonism, between native-born workers and immigrant workers, a dynamic, though, the source notes business groups have historically leveraged to keep labor costs down and prevent unified worker action.
But it's not all one-sided. The source acknowledges elites sometimes do act for the broader good.
Yes, that's important. It's not presented as deterministic. While elites often prioritize their own interests, like during the First Gilded Age, there are historical periods where they implemented policies that benefited society more broadly, even at some short-term cost to themselves.
The Great Compression era in the U.S. being the key example, roughly 1930s to 1970s.
Exactly. A period of significantly decreasing inequality, reversing the earlier trend. The source calls this an exceptional, hopeful case, because these major reforms happened in the U.S. without a violent revolution or state collapse, unlike in many other historical situations.
What drove that change, according to the source? Why did elites agree to policies that reduced their share of the pie?
Threats seem to have been crucial, both internal and external.
Internal like?
Labor radicalism, socialists, anarchists.
Yeah.
The source mentions things like the 1920 Wall Street bombing, the 1927 Bath School bombing as signs of deep unrest, and then external threats.
Communism, fascism, the Soviet Union.
Right. That combination of internal pressure and external geopolitical competition was apparently instrumental in convincing enough of the U.S. ruling class to adopt reforms things coming out of the progressive era and the New Deal that effectively throttled the wealth pump for several decades and reversed inequality.
So was it just fear? Or did elite values actually change? Did they start to believe more in social cooperation by the post-war period?
The source suggests it was probably both. Fear was likely a primary motivator, but the reforms enacted did have real costs for the wealthiest, whose fortunes actually declined in real terms during that period. So maybe a shift in values played a role too.
It shows that significant change is possible, even if driven by uncomfortable factors like fear.
Exactly. Fear or foresight can act as a leveler.
Okay, let's shift from the ruling class to the dissidents. People critical of the system, but not necessarily revolutionaries.
Right. On that traditional left-right spectrum, the source puts the ruling class and loyal politicians in the center. Radicals are way out on the extremes. Dissidents are somewhere in between, critical, wanting change, but generally working within the system's bounds.
So, left-wing dissidents today, figures like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren.
They're presented as examples, advocating populist economic policies, higher minimum wage, taxing the wealthy more heavily. The source notes Sanders is somewhat unique among prominent Democrats for his skepticism about open borders, calling it a Koch brothers proposal.
Linking it to business interests wanting cheap labor.
Correct. And the source makes the argument that the Democratic Party itself, particularly starting around the Clinton era, largely moved away from its traditional working-class focus towards the center, adopting policies more palatable to ruling class interests to win elections.
And how does the media treat these different kinds of dissent?
It's interesting. The source argues that what you might call cultural left issues, focusing on race, ethnicity, gender, LGBTQ+ rights, intersectionality tend to get significant airtime and focus in major corporate media outlets.
Okay.
But more fundamental, populist economic critiques or deep critiques of militarism and foreign policy, like those from someone like Noam Chomsky historically, are often ignored or marginalized by those same corporate media outlets,
Uh-huh.
which keeps those voices less influential.
Now, what about right-wing dissidents? How are they presented?
Differently, the source argues the Republican Party, historically a bastion of the ruling class, is undergoing this major shift, potentially transforming into what the book calls a true revolutionary party.
Triggered by Trump's election in 2016.
That's presented as the watershed moment. Trump is seen as a kind of political entrepreneur who very effectively tapped into and channeled the deep discontent among the working class, especially white voters without college degrees.
And his policies were a mixed bag for elites.
Some things aligned tax cuts, conservative judges, but others went directly against powerful elite interests. The source highlights his aggressive anti-immigration stance as maybe the worst offense from the perspective of groups like the Chamber of Commerce who favor looser borders.
And Tucker Carlson is singled out.
Yes, as a sort of prototypical counter-elite figure, someone providing a coherent ideology for this emerging new right, particularly laid out in his book Ship of Fools.
What are the core arguments from Carlson highlighted in the source?
It quotes him describing Trump's election as a visceral reaction, a throbbing middle finger, a howl of rage from a country feeling abandoned and made desperate by decades of elite decisions.
Pretty strong language.
And the source lists his key critiques. He argues Democrats became the party of the rich, converging with Republicans. He criticizes the marriage of market capitalism to progressive social values, suggesting diversity initiatives are a cheap substitute for raising wages. Bowing to the diversity agenda is a lot cheaper. He hits hard on mass immigration, arguing it's pushed by business to suppress wages, and points out the Democrats' shifting stance on it. He slams bipartisan support for endless foreign wars.
What about free speech?
He argues it's suppressed by both sides of the ruling class, seeing disagreement itself as suspect, as the first step toward insurrection, and calls journalists handmaidens to power.
And he directly addresses the wealth pump.
Yeah, asking fundamental questions like, why do we tax capital at half the rate of labor? He argues these core economic issues are ignored, and identity politics is used deliberately to divide people. Quickest way to control the population is to turn it against itself.
So the source presents him as wanting to overthrow the current elites, though maybe not destroy the country itself?
That seems to be the interpretation, and it leaves this intriguing question hanging. Given Carlson's platform on Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch, a powerful elite figure himself, how seriously did Murdoch take Carlson's anti-elite message? Or was it just good business?
A fascinating dynamic. All this analysis, moving from individuals to big data, structural forces, wealth bumps, it's part of this larger approach the source calls a science of history, or cliodynamics.
Yes, cliodynamics. It's presented as using mathematical models, ideas from dynamical systems theory, and crucially, large data sets, whether that's modern big data or painstakingly compiled historical data.
And it's different from older approaches.
Very different from, say, the great man theory, focusing only on leaders, or psychohistory, which the source really dismisses as pseudoscience because it deduces facts from theory instead of testing theory against data.
So cliodynamics tries to find the underlying reasons for dysfunction.
Exactly. It looks at things like factionalism, repression, breakdown of governance and democracy, not just as warning signs, but as symptoms that deep structural problems are already well underway.
And it needs good data. The source mentions some limitations of modern conflict data.
Yeah, data sets like the Political Instability Task Force, PITF, mostly cover the period after 1955. That happens to be a relatively calm spell globally between major instability waves, and it's heavily weighted towards ethnic conflicts in newly independent states. So relying only on that might overstate ethnicity's role compared to these deeper structural factors like elite overproduction.
Which is why historical databases are so important for this approach.
Absolutely. Since you can't just download spreadsheets from the past, researchers have to get creative with proxies.
Proxies.
Indirect indicators found in historical records, like painstakingly analyzing old church records, baptisms, marriages, burials to reconstruct population trends and family structures centuries ago.
Or using things like tax records, like the Doomsday Book in England, or old Chinese administrative records.
Precisely. Squeezing quantitative data out of qualitative or administrative sources. The source actually mentions a real-world project doing this, the SEICHAT. Global History Databank,
Those are-
launched in 2011. It's this huge collaborative effort. Historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, data scientists, all working together to build a massive database of historical and archaeological information, specifically designed for testing theories like this.
That's incredible. The source even uses a sci-fi analogy, a macroscope.
Yeah, from a novel. Characters using vast data sets and complex models to predict historical trajectories. One character, Zickel, builds a model of the contemporary U.S. back in 2010 based on dynamics similar to antebellum America.
And the model predicts.
A serious outbreak of political violence peaking in the early 2020s. And the fictional character's tragedy is seeing it coming but being powerless to stop it, just watching it unfold.
A cautionary tale, perhaps. It highlights that this kind of data-driven history is becoming possible now.
Yes. Thanks to the explosion of data and computational power since around 2000, cliodynamics is moving from a theoretical possibility to a practical research program.
Okay, let's quickly cover a couple more of the core mechanisms the source says drive these dynamics besides the wealth pump. One is contagion.
Right. Instability can spread, kind of like a virus or an idea. The Arab Spring is the classic recent example cited.
Starting in Tunisia.
After that, street vendors' self-immolation.
Mm.
But it spread rapidly to other countries like Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, countries that shared similar underlying structural conditions. High youth unemployment, corruption, stagnant economies. The idea of protest became the contagious agent.
Makes sense. The other one was dynamic entrainment. That sounds a bit more abstract.
It is, but think of it like this. Imagine different societies or empires as separate metronomes, each swinging back and forth between stable and unstable periods based on their own internal dynamics.
Okay, like their own internal cycles.
Exactly. Now imagine some external force that affects many of them, maybe a big climate shift, a major pandemic, or the actions of a dominant neighboring empire. This external force can act like a little nudge.
And the nudge does what?
If these societies' internal cycles started out of sync, these repeated external nudges can gradually cause their cycles to line up, to become synchronized or entrained. The external force doesn't cause the internal cycle, but it can coordinate the timing across different systems.
Any examples?
The source mentions speculation that maybe England exporting instability to France during the 100 Years' War might have actually delayed England's own internal crisis peak by shifting some pressure externally. It's complex interplay.
So these mechanisms, wealth pump, contagion, entrainment, they interact to create these big historical patterns.
That's the idea. And the source uses several historical cases to show them in action.
Like the Wars of the Roses in medieval England, we often think of it as just Lancaster versus York.
But the source paints a picture of much deeper, more brutal intro-like conflict than earlier baronial disputes. 3 kings deposed or killed, dozens of high nobles executed without trial, and it wasn't just at the top.
Right, you mentioned private wars.
Widespread private warfare between rival elite factions at the regional and local levels. And common people suffered terribly extortion, robbery, murder, caught in the crossfire of elite infighting. It was a different level of violence compared to, say, the Magna Carta Rebellion, which was more limited and negotiated.
What about Mamluk Egypt?
A fascinating case. An elite military slave caste, the Mamluks, overthrow their masters, the Ayyubids, in 1250, but their own dynasty faced severe internal instability relatively quickly, lasting less than a century before major problems.
And the source links that to elite structure.
It suggests that societies with polygamous elites, where powerful men can have many wives and children, tend to overproduce potential heirs and elite aspirants much faster, leading potentially to shorter cycles of stability before elite competition boils over.
And the Mamluks eventually fell?
Conquered by the Ottomans in 1517, partly because they failed to keep up technologically, especially with the gunpowder weapons. And much later, the source mentions Muhammad Ali's solution to Mamluk elite overproduction in 1805.
The massacre.
Inviting the Mamluk leaders to a feast and having them killed. A, quote, rather extreme approach, as the source dryly puts it. But it did consolidate his power and establish a dynasty that lasted nearly 150 years. A stark reset.
Okay, moving to more hopeful examples.
Yeah.
Reform Russia in the 19th century.
Right. The source frames serfdom initially as this kind of harsh social contract, enabling Muscovy to survive against tough neighbors. Gentry serve the state, peasants support the gentry. But that compact breaks down, especially after 1762 when the gentry were freed from obligatory service.
Leaving the nobility looking like parasites by the 1860s.
Exactly. So abolishing serfdom was essential, but it took a near-revolutionary situation to force it past entrenched noble opposition.
But the reforms worked eventually.
The source argues yes. The comprehensive reforms after that mid-century crisis, not just emancipation, but judicial, military, local government reforms took decades to implement fully, but the data suggests they did successfully reduce social tensions. Peasant disturbances decreased, political terror incidents went down after peaking. Russia averted revolution then, unlike in 1917.
And Chartist Britain in the same century. Another success story.
Presented as one, yes. Britain faced huge unrest, the Chartist movement demanding political rights, widespread economic hardship. But crucially, a significant fraction of the British elite became convinced that reforms were necessary to avoid revolution.
What were the key reforms?
The 1832 Reform Act expanded voting rights, shifting power towards the rising industrial and commercial elites. Poor laws were eventually amended, and critically, the repeal of the Corn Laws.
Those were tariffs on grain.
Yes, benefiting landowners but making food incredibly expensive for workers, fueling immiseration. Repealing them helped alleviate hardship. Plus, the long struggle for trade union rights was vital.
And the result?
Real wages, which had stagnated or fallen, started to regain ground and grew rapidly after 1867. So Britain managed to navigate its crisis through reform, not revolution. It shows that fear, or maybe foresight, can motivate elites towards leveling reforms.
And back to the U.S., the Gilded Age versus Great Compression contrast serves the same point.
Exactly. It demonstrates that even within the same country, elite behavior isn't fixed. Under threat, whether internal or external, they can shift towards policies that benefit the broader society, reducing inequality, even if it temporarily reduces their own relative share.
The source also touches on how even democracies can be, well, captured.
Yeah, it suggests that the outward forms of democracy elections, parliaments don't guarantee that a state is run for the benefit of the broad population. Some states are effectively run by and for narrow plutocratic elites.
Ukraine before 2014 is given as an example.
Yes, where politics was allegedly heavily influenced by oligarchs, whose wealth, often stashed in Western banks, ironically made them vulnerable to Western pressure like asset freezes. A complex dynamic of internal plutocracy and external influence.
And state collapse itself isn't that rare historically.
No, the source points out it's actually quite frequent. A sudden breakdown of the power structures can happen from external defeat, losing a war, or internal forces, a coup, a revolution, or even structurally, like the Southern planter elite, losing their status, wealth, and political power after the U.S. Civil War, fundamentally changing the American elite landscape.
So, bringing it all together, what does the source's model suggest lies ahead for the U.S. based on these dynamics? Is there a prediction?
It presents what it calls an inertial scenario. Basically, what happens if things continue on their current trajectory? If the underlying structural problems, the wealth pump, elite overproduction, aren't fundamentally addressed.
And that scenario looks like?
It projects a period of major crisis, a potential cataclysm, peaking sometime in the 2020s. In the model, this crisis actually reduces elite numbers and competition, leading to a temporary decrease in instability afterwards.
So a temporary calm after the storm.
Potentially. Violence might decline, radicals might become more moderate as the immediate pressure eases. The system finds a kind of rough, temporary equilibrium.
But there's a catch.
The big catch is that the underlying causes, the wealth pump driving inequality and elite overproduction, haven't been fixed in this scenario. So after the crisis, elite numbers start growing again. The generation that lived through the crisis retires or dies off.
Man.
An uneasy peace might hold for a generation, maybe 25, 30 years. But the model suggests that because the root causes remain, the conditions for instability will simply rebuild, leading to a repeat of the 2020-style crisis, perhaps 50 years later. A cycle of recurring instability.
That's a pretty grim inertial path, recurring crises.
It is. But the source deliberately contrasts that with the more optimistic view drawn from those historical success stories.
Chartist Britain, Reform Russia, the U.S. Great Compression.
Exactly. Those cases show that rebalancing the system, shutting down the wealth pump, managing elite numbers without needing a catastrophic war or bloody revolution is possible. It has happened.
So death and destruction aren't the only historical levelers.
The source argues no. Fear of collapse or perhaps intelligent foresight and evolving pro-social values among enough elites can also work as a leveler. It's difficult, requires overcoming immense resistance, but history shows it's not impossible.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for us listening to this? We've taken this deep dive into how these big structural forces, elite overproduction, popular immiseration, intra-elite conflict, analyzed through complexity science and historical data, give us a really powerful, if maybe unsettling, framework.
Yeah, a framework for understanding why societies get into trouble. And we've seen these dynamics aren't just abstract theories. They've played out again and again in very different times and places. Medieval England, Mamluk Egypt, 19th century Europe, and the model suggests they're strongly at play right now in the contemporary U.S., driving a lot of the polarization and tension we see.
And crucially, we've also seen that societies aren't necessarily doomed to follow that inertial path towards collapse. History offers examples, exceptions, where timely, significant reforms did manage to avert the worst outcomes, often driven by that elite fear, maybe, or maybe moments of foresight.
Right. It
Uh,
leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on, doesn't it? Given these historical patterns that the data seems to reveal and the trends we see around us, are we just inevitably heading for that major crisis the inertial scenario predicts?
Oh,
Or can we actually learn from those past successes, those moments of reform, and find a different path by tackling these deep structural problems head on?
challenging question indeed, something for all of us to think about.